Welcome to the report from the National Earthworm Recording Scheme as part of the annual general meeting for the Earthworm Society of Britain for 2022. My name's Keiron Brown and I'm the National Recorder for Earthworms and the Recording Officer for the Earthworm Society of Britain. I'm going to start with a quick update on what we've had records-wise in for the recording scheme, and then I'm going to tell you about a few projects that me and some others have been working on over the past year. So first of all, just a recap of what the recording scheme is. Our data comes to us from two main types of sources. We have records that come in from earthworm recorders, which are amateur naturalists that send in their earthworm species occurrence records. They come in usually through iRecord, where they're validated and verified, and then they enter into the National Earthworm Recording Scheme. We also get data sets from research institutions, and that can be anything from universities to government agencies, etc. That data all gets combined in the National Earthworm Recording Scheme, and we then go on to share it locally with local environmental record centres, nationally through the National Biodiversity Network Atlas, and internationally through the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. For Irish data, rather than going into the NBN Atlas, that goes into a platform called Biodiversity Ireland, but like the NBN Atlas data, it ends up on the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. So all of the data that we work with is made publicly available, and it is available for use at full resolution. So the National Earthworm Recording Scheme this year, there's just some summary figures up here on the slide. You can see that we've had 1,794 records in this year. That is quite good. It may look like it pales a little bit in comparison to some previous years. What we've got to remember is that the research data comes in peaks and troughs. When we get a big research data set in, it really impacts the amount of data coming in. We've had a good year for biological records from the network of recorders across the UK. We can see there from the country figures on the left that all is not even. We do get a lot more data in through England. A lot of our Scottish data is actually research data rather than data from recorders, and Wales is quite underrepresented there as well. So there's still a lot to do in making sure that we've got good coverage across the UK. In total now we have 21,760 earthworm species occurrence records. So this is really quite unprecedented. A lot of earthworm research that's been done on earthworm data before has been done on a lot less. We're talking between 3,000 and 7,000. So we're now at a point where we can start using that data to kind of look at what's happening with our earthworms and where we need to focus our efforts next. And that's going to inform some of the projects that I'm going to tell you about in a minute. Before I do, I just want to give a shout out to an introduction to recording earthworms in Wiltshire webinar that myself and Kerry Calloway are doing on the 13th of October. This is still open for bookings, and it's free to attend, so you can book that through Eventbrite, and there'll be a link to this in the YouTube description. Right, okay, so the first little project that I want to tell you about is updating our earthworm distribution maps. So what we know about earthworms, the only published data, distribution data on earthworms was from 2009 data that was published, I think, in 2012 as part of a paper by Dan Carpenter et al. And that mapped earthworms, all species, and 4 individual species. And so what I've done now is with the help of Rich Burtmar, I've mapped all British species, and I'm going to just do a little bit of a comparison. What I'd like to do is start looking next year if there's somewhere where we can publish these distribution maps so that there is published data there that's out in the ether for people to use. So if we look at all species of earthworm, the map on the left is the 2009 data, and the map on the right is the 2022 data. Now, that isn't the most up to date. That is from late spring, early summer when we got these maps done. Now we can still see that there are a lot of gaps, but what we can see is that there are a lot more dots on that map than there were, and that is in a huge part to our recorders and our research partners that have given us data as well. So there's a lot of dots there in England, Northern Ireland in particular, that we didn't have before. All right. moving on, if we break this down by species, so one of the species that was mapped in that paper was Lumbricus terrestris, which is known to be a common and widespread species. What we can see from the data on the right is that we don't have a great deal more data, and that data still reflects where we're limited in the amount of data that we've got in, but we can see that there are more dots on the map. Something with Lumbricus terrestris in particular that we need to be aware of is it's thought that it may be under threat from the New Zealand flatworm. So having more data about that in areas where the New Zealand flatworm is and also where it isn't helps us look at that story. So I'm very keen to get more data on that in Scotland, and producing these maps helps us show where these evidence gaps are. If we look at another common species, but one that isn't as well recorded, Eisenia fetida is a common composting earthworm. It didn't show up very much in the 2009 data because that was mainly based on research data, and very little research data is on earthworms from compost heaps. It's mainly from the soil pit and leaf litter recording of sites, where you won't find Eisenia fetida anywhere near as much. We've still got a long way to go, as you can see from the map on the right, but you can see there that dots are starting to appear, so we're starting to get more information about this species. If we look at something a bit more rare though, Dendrobina attempsi is a small epigeic earthworm. The map on the left from the research data shows there's only a very few data points. We can see that we've made a significant impact on the amount of data there on the right hand side. So although the data is sparse, this is something that is maybe a bit more habitat specific. Maybe we don't have enough information about its ecology, but we are getting more data which will help inform that, help us know where to look for it more, and what might be happening with its ecology and its populations. So that's the first project, and that's the comparison with the 2009 data. But what we're also able to do here is publish data on species that have never ever had a distribution map of the British Isles published. So I've got some examples here. These tell some stories from our data that we wouldn't have had in the previous data. So Eisenia tetrahedra, we've got a really good data set for that in England in particular, due to a data set from the Environment Agency from their kick sampling of streams. So that shows up there. It's the only earthworm that they record, but it means that we've got a lot more data, a lot more dots on the map than we ever would have had otherwise. Bimastis eisenia is an earthworm that was previously thought to be rare, but we're finding that it is more of a microhabitat specialist that wouldn't show up in research data. And you can see there's a lot more dots on the map there, and they're comparable with other common species like Lumbricus terrestris in terms of the density of dots. Octalasian cyanium is another one that was under-recorded in the research data, but when we start combining the recorded data with it, we see that it is more common and widespread than perhaps we would have known from the previous data. So all of the records that we've built up from our recorders are really helping tell that story and give us that picture of that species. Where the data gets really interesting though is we can now publish distribution maps of really rare species like Dendrobina pygmaea, because our recorders have been fantastic, and some of our research partners actually, at finding this species. And yeah, way more dots on that map, even though it looks very sparse, than we would have had back in 2009. So moving on, some of the little projects that are coming out of the recording scheme that I wanted to share. First of all, the Research Bias and Habitat Association study is a research project that's been led by Frank Ashwood and that I'm working with him on, and looking at the research data that we have currently versus the recorded data, and looking at habitat, microhabitat associations for individual species. So here we've got a representation of the data that we currently had as of the 30th of June. So on the map on the right, you can see research and recorder records, and you can see on the left the proportion. So you can see there that there is a lot of research data. And what Frank, I, and the other researchers on the paper want to look at is, does this have an impact on what we think we know about earthworm species, and does it tell us where we should be focusing more of our efforts? So just to give you a sneak peek, as we're still in the process of analysing the data and looking at the results, this is from some preliminary results. Oh no, this isn't actually. This is from some data that I've put together outside of the statistical analysis that just compares. On the right, you've got a Natural England report that ranks abundance of earthworm earthworm species, looking at the data they had from the 2009-2012 data. And they've ranked all of the species from most abundant to least abundant. I've then used the recorder data and mirrored that analysis and put that on the left-hand side. And what we can see there is that the pattern isn't the same. So the recorder data is telling us different things about the abundance of different species. So this means that the information in the 2014 Natural England report on earthworm distributions in Great Britain, some of those rarity and habitat specific data that came out of that may be biased because of the research data. For example, Mercione muldali is showing up as a lot rarer in the earthworm recorder data versus the research data that the Natural England report looked at. I think something else that's also really interesting here is that the curve is a lot less steep. So if I arranged the data on the left hand side so that it was in order from most abundant to least abundant, what you'd find is the curve is not as steep. It plateaus more gently, and that means that we're getting better representation of all species rather than just the ones that are most commonly found. And the reason for that, I believe, is from the Natural England report. A lot of that data was from agriculture, so that data is probably skewed towards earthworms that you find in agriculture. But if we want to look at this in a bit more detail, the statistician that's working with us has done a bit of preliminary analysis. This will change as we do more work on this and as we refine our data set. Like I said, this research project has been led by Dr. Frank Ashwood from not just the Earthworm Society of Britain, but Forest Research. And this data here, it shows you microhabitat, which we get from the sampling method used, against main habitat, broad habitat type. And we've separated out the data into recording scheme and research data. And basically the darker the square, so the more purple, the more dark purple the square there, the more representation there is for that sampling method and habitat. And what we can see if we look at the research data on the right hand side is that farmland in the bottom left hand corner with sole pit is really heavily represented. There's a lot of data on that, whereas if we look at something like turnover, so turning over items that are not deadwood, that microhabitat is very rarely looked at in the research data at all. So the research data, there's a lot of clear squares and there's a few really dark squares. If we look at the recording scheme data, we get a slightly different picture. Sole pit versus with vermifuge, so that is using like a mustard solution to get earthworms out of the ground. That sampling method is rarely used by our recorders together because quite often if they do both of those, they'll report the data separately. So that's why that's not there. But what we are finding there is the squares are not as polar, they're not as dark or light, there's much more of a gradient. What that tells us is that the recording scheme data is bringing in a wider variety of habitats and sampling methods. So it's therefore more likely to pick up things that might be habitat or microhabitat specific, or even habitat, broad habitat and microhabitat specific. And we'll report more on this in the future when the research paper comes out, but I just wanted to give you a sneak peek at what we're kind of doing with the data so that our recorders and our members can see that we are now starting to put that data to really good use. So the second project that we've got that I'm leading on with Emma Sherlock from the Natural History Museum and obviously chair of the Earthworm Society of Britain is our ecological categories and behaviour review. And this comes from the fact that we in the scientific community tend to break down earthworms into three ecological groups. That is epigeic earthworms, that are surface dwelling earthworms feeding on decaying plant material and animal waste. Anesic earthworms, that are deep burrowing earthworms feeding on soil and decaying plant material. And endogeic earthworms, that are shallow burrowing earthworms feeding on soil. And this all comes from work by Marcel Bouche, a French earthworm taxonomist and ecologist that published his work in the 1970s. However, in 2020, a team of French scientists revisited his ecological categories, and they reported that and reminded us that Marcel Bouche's work wasn't supposed to be as polar as that is, where you've got three categories. When he did it, he talked more about things being on a triangular scale, with each of those ecological categories being one of the polar points. So we refer to it as Bouche's triangle. And when he did this, his theory of these ecological categories, or the scale that they go on, was based on three different classifications. Vertical distribution, but he didn't use that within his classification due to variation resulting from climatic and environmental conditions. So it's something that could vary very seasonally, for example. He did it based on the other two features, which were ecology, and they were based on Bouche's personal observations or experience. They were unquantified, and it's very difficult for us to replicate these because we don't know exactly what they were based on. And morphology. With that, what Bouche did was he categorized 15 morpho-anatomical features that he described, and he used them to as part of his classification system. So what the French team have done is they came up with a model where you feed in these morpho-anatomical features and it gives you a point on the triangle. So it will tell you what ecological category that comes out as. And rather than just having the three types, we've actually got 7. So we've got the 3 polar types, epigeic, endogeic and anesic. We've also got 3 categories that combine 2 of those. So epianesic, we've got endoanesic and epiendogeic. And then there's also a 7th category where things that fall somewhere between all 3 of those, an intermediary category, if you will, and that's defined in the paper as epiendoanesic. When this paper was done, the taxonomy that they used was the same taxonomy that Bouche had back in 1970, and some of that is disputed, some of it is different from how we've got things categorized now. So what we'd like to do is put the species as we know them in the British Isles, so the Irish and the UK species, we'd like to put them into the model and get definitions for them using the model. And that's something that we're working with the French team, and I'm working with Emma Sherlock as well to do that, because we'd like a bit more, we'd like to publish something that clearly defines what ecological category, according to this model, according to the morphology, our British and Irish species fall into. But we want to do a bit more than that as well. We want to also revisit the behavior of these and see if that matches up. So as well as putting it through the model, well, including putting them through the model, there are 4 things that myself, Emma and Dr. Bottinelli are going to do. The first is that we're going to focus on Lumbricidae species. So we have 2 non-Lumbricidae species in the UK. I don't know how well the model will work for them, so we've decided to discount them from the model, and we're going to focus on the 29 Lumbricidae species. Emma and I have already updated the morpho-anatomical information for the British and the Irish species. Some of the features that Bouche uses are not standard things that other taxonomists use, so it did take a bit of work, and a huge thank you to Emma for all of the help with doing that. The next 2 things that we're going to do we're going to apply the Bottinelli et al. Model to assign Bouche triangle positions and determine the ecological category based on the morpho-anatomical features. But we're also going to perform a literature review of the following behaviours for each species. So we're going to pull out from the scientific literature what species specific information we've got about the behaviours that would match up with these ecological categories that we're defining based on morphoanatomical features. So we want to try and match up the morphology with the ecology, so that we go a bit more back to the classification that Bouche originally defined. And the 5 types of behaviour that we're going to look for information on are burrowing, casting, feeding, environmental responses and reproduction. Okay, so we're going to report a bit more on this in an Ento Live webinar. These are free webinars and they're available to book. Again, I'll put the link in the YouTube description underneath the recording. And that will be on the 2nd of February. So there'll be a bigger update about what we're doing with these projects then. And then I just wanted to mention one more thing that is now open for things. It's something that I'm personally doing outside of the Earthworm Society of Britain, but one thing I learned from going to the International Symposium on Earthworm Ecology this year and meeting earthworm scientists from around the world is there's so much going on that we don't hear about in the UK. So I set up a Worms of the World virtual symposium, which is going to feature earthworm scientists from around the globe. So some of the confirmed speakers include Sam James, who is a renowned earthworm taxonomist and has described many species from around the world, including the fried eggs worm, which you see in the image here. I've also got speakers speaking about the giant earthworms that create these giant mounds and these specific wetland habitats in South America. And I've got another speaker that's going to be talking about Lumbricidae and other types of earthworm as invasive species in North America. So it's not to be missed. And again, I will drop a link in the YouTube description.